relates life. This is how the box is maintained. This is how the social contract is ordered. And so in 1920, the 19th Amendment is passed. One of the people who votes for that is a lady named Rankin. She was the first woman ever elected to Congress, before women had the right to vote. The pertinent question then is, how does she get elected to Congress if women weren't allowed to vote? Who voted for her? Men voted for her. Men who came to the realization that the system was not fair, it wasn't equitable, that we needed to open the door. Janet went around, I think it was Montana she went to, and she convinced men that she was reliable, that she could be trusted to make political decisions that would benefit society in general, and they elected her. Before women had the right to vote, she voted for women to have the right to vote. 1920. To say that then is to say this. Back in the early 60s, maybe 21% of the American population believed in same-sex marriage rights, to pursue your own happiness based on your self-interest. Today, it's up to 57%. It took 60 years, but it's up to 57%. I'm going to guess that about 25% of the population will never agree with that. They'll always stand against it, which means there's 18% that can still be won over. The question that the third wave of feminism is asking itself is, do we fight a battle with people who never can be changed? Or do we spend our energies and time trying to win over the other 18% and having a majority of 75? And that's where the third wave is. Let's get everybody on board we can get on board. There's always going to be someone who's not willing to get on board. That's life. But we still have work to do, people. We still have major work to do. And that's the presentation I want to do to you today, to explain how we've evolved, both male and female, and come to the realization that this is a battle worth fighting for, and that the battle is being won, but it's not done. We have to continue to pursue it. Any questions for me about how I've laid that out? Okay. Let me share just a few thoughts about the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granted women right to vote, a right known as women's suffrage, ratified in 1920, ending almost a century of protest. During America's early history, women were denied some of the basic rights enjoyed by male citizens. For example, married women could not own property. By the way, to be able to vote, in the early days, you had to be able to own property. You couldn't be property and own property at the same time. It was hardly ever talked about in the 19th Amendment, when women got the right to vote, is now you're no longer property. It's about voting, it's about participation in the electoral process, but it also, at its very core, means you're no longer anybody's property. And that's a huge victory. We gave that to the slave population in 1848. Emancipation Proclamation. Women had to wait till 1920 before legally they are no longer the property of their husbands. You could participate now in the system to a degree you're not allowed to participate before. They had no legal claim to any money they owned or they earned. It belonged to the male. No female had the right to vote. Women were expected to focus on housework and motherhood, not politics. On the other hand, many American women resisted the notion that the ideal woman was a pious, submissive wife and mother concerned exclusively with home and family. Combined, these factors contributed to a new way of thinking about what it meant to be a woman and a citizen in the United States. Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Michigan all extended the voting right to women. Southern states did not until it came to Tennessee. And there was one gentleman, his name was Harry Byrne, became the swing vote in Tennessee. If it wasn't for his vote, we would not have the 19th Amendment. One man saw the validity of making the dream that we're all created equal come true. So we go from theory to the real world we live in. We need to persuade one another in the rightness of actions. And people can be persuaded. There's going to be a minority group, you will never persuade them. But the more people that can be persuaded are persuaded, the stronger the movement becomes. And this is not just for feminism. We talked about equal rights, equal protection, same-sex marriage. whatever people are entitled to according to what the theory says, that you're endowed with certain rights you cannot be alienated from, to life, liberty, so that you can pursue your interests and obtain the highest level of freedom that you can obtain. Everybody understand that? So I want you to really understand that feminism has its roots also in male cooperation. Women decided enough was enough, but in that persuasion, they imagined themselves capable of bringing themselves to a theater that required cooperation. It still requires cooperation, people. How many of you have Professor Collins? I've done some presentations when Friday was there, Professor Collins was there, and we've had some very, very good, fundamental, nice talks about it. One of Professor Collins' kind of core principles is that men need to be loved too. You can bring someone on board when you embrace them rather than when you stiff-arm them. And we need to understand that that's a possibility. It's work, people. It's real work. Probably the most revelationary moment I've ever had when it came to the feminist movement. I was talking to a lady friend of mine, Barbara Ambrose. Really, I mean, we were born on the same birth date, but a year apart. We would talk for hours. We were in my apartment talking for hours and hours, and suddenly I got very personal in what I was saying, and I stopped. And Barbara looked at me, she says, what's wrong? And I said, well, I can't believe I'm telling you this stuff. And she said, why? And I said, because you're a woman. And Barbara said, well, I'm a human being, and I happen to come in female form, Larry. Wow. Wow. Now, I was not resistant to the feminist movement. I just had those biases that are built into us. You're not born with them. They're built into you. I'll get to that in a minute when we go through Hilde Lindemann. And that bias just came to the surface. And in one moment, she was able to just take that away. Never again looked at people that way. Male, female, whatever their orientation is, it doesn't matter anymore. Not that it mattered then, but it was there. It's a bias that we carry with us. We all carry biases with us, whether we know it or not. And every once in a while, one of those enlightenment moments comes, and it's like, wow, that's interesting. If it wasn't for Mr. Byrne, well, you still would have had to fight a little bit longer. I believe sooner or later someone would have come to their senses and would have said, yeah, we need to give women the right to vote. But it just happened to be with that person at that time in a state of Tennessee, a southern state, and the southern states were more resistant than the northern states to extend equality to women. Any questions about that? So you got the right to vote in 1920, and by 1960 we finally let you in the courtroom because you were just too emotional. You couldn't rationalize important decisions like life and death. And thank God Carol Gilligan came along and pointed out in a different voice that we're really not that different people. We've just been given certain privileges and access to power that has been denied other people. It's created social problems for us. And we have the capacity to level the playing field, bring equality to the table, if we choose to do that, but not without a fight.
Since you were talking about, and I'm assuming this has a lot to do with America, but here's my question. Okay, so for years you had...
Loud enough for everybody to hear.
You had queens or you had princesses, but in that aspect they were always subservient to the king?
They were the one, yes, that's a great question. If you didn't have a male to inherit the line, you gave it to a female because you didn't want the line broken. But they were not the first choice. Like when Queen Elizabeth in England passes, it's going to go to a male. Now her husband may be too old, but it'll go to Prince, not Charles, but the other two. And it'll always be that. That's how the line has been preserved. So it's for preservation rather than for recognition of a woman's right. Yes?
Doesn't it sometimes show like cousins and stuff?
Well, to keep it in the family, yes it does. But it's always to preserve power. And power is to keep, what's your name?
James.
James. James, and you alluded to it, but you hit it right. It's about access to power. Power is where control occurs. Control doesn't have to be bad. It's what you do with it. Control is just control. Okay? And so it's maintaining the power structure within the family. So that when another male comes, we'll do that. Now, we've had Catherine the Great, we had Golda Meir in Israel, we had Margaret Thatcher in England, we've had Indira Gandhi in India. I forget the name of the lady in I think it's Thailand. So we've had women come to the forefront in the modern era. Long way to go, but we've had women come to the forefront.
I believe they actually changed the rule now where it's just the first one comes into power. Republic. So like Princess Charlotte, like when it's her time, if she ever gets there, she'll actually be queen.
Have they modified that enough now?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So even there in the divine right of kings, we're having some progress being made. Okay, still keeps it in the family though.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Thank you. I did not know that. Thank you. And by the way, at the end of the semester, we'll have an exit interview, and someone always says, so what did you learn from us? What's your name?
Natalia.
Natalia?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's brand new. I appreciate that. I didn't realize that.
And like you said earlier, I think the point is to be made that, like you said with that man in Tennessee, we wouldn't have made that progress if it wasn't for him to realize, wait a minute, this change should be made.
And Janet Rankin, when you think, how did a woman, before women had the right to vote, get elected to political office? She actually voted against World War I and World War II. She was an isolationist. She didn't think we had a place in being part of Europe's problems. That's their problems. Back then, we called it the other side of the lake. We didn't see the world as integrated. We weren't that integrated. She voted against both. But the majesty of it is she got elected, and the only way to get elected back then is if men voted for you. And she was able to persuade them. So women do have persuasive powers. I mean, she persuaded enough people in her state to vote for her. Now, it's a marginal state, doesn't have a large population. I forget if it was in Idaho or Montana, but still, it required her to persuade males. And she was running against a male. Crack in the wall, that's all it was. But we've slowly expanded, and we continue to expand the capacity. Your generation has done so much better than my generation when it came to recognizing these things. And not just intellectually, but living life differently than my generation did. You're not the end of the story, people. You can't afford to be the end of the story. Okay. So Hilde Lindemann, she's a German ethicist, and I posted a conversation that she had with a newspaper in Germany. It'd be helpful to read it. What is feminism? She says it's not fundamentally about equality or women, but rather about power. Focuses on differences of power which are based on gender. Now, gender is normally understood biologically, male, female. We have generally the same parts until it comes to the procreation parts, and there we differ. But notice how they all fit together. We'll get to that next week when we talk about traditional moral sexuality and libertarian sexuality. She says gender is a norm, not a fact. She accepts the fact that we're different biologically. But what is it that makes a woman and a man a man? It's a power relation which tells people how they're supposed to behave, seems to be based on biology, but it's actually a social intervention. So from the earliest days, when you're born, you are taught without, how do I say this? What I say, without prejudice, without intention to hurt people, you're taught what it means to be a male and a female. Boys don't cry. Women are emotional. Women wear pink. Men wear fuchsia. But then I cry. What can I say? And we're taught our roles, male and female, for the most part. And once we adopt those roles, we fit in. And if we don't adopt those roles, we don't fit in. We find ourselves left out in some social settings, maybe in all social settings. So what Lindemann is not saying is that gender is not biology. Of course it's biology. It would be ridiculous to say that we're not different between male and female. But she says gender as it's experienced